Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
And welcome to the Wolfman Chronicles. This is Chapter 3 of Book 7, and it's Episode 80, Trapped, a fight for survival. Miguel listened for Jack's howl far off in the distance, the howl that meant he had found food or shelter or help. It hurt to breathe. Though he wasn't sure if it was the bitter cold air freezing his lungs or the broken ribs. His breath came in short, painful rasps. It was getting more difficult to move, more difficult to keep his body from shivering in violent spasms. He knew he was drifting in and out of consciousness now, merely because one minute he'd be aware of the surroundings, aware of the icy, frigid wind that blew relentlessly into the small cabin of the plane, the only shelter they had. And the next, he'd be feeling the hot warmth of the desert sun on his skin, back at the ranch in Mexico. The other passengers, the few that were still alive, huddled close together, trying to keep themselves from freezing. The fire was merely a handful of embers now. They'd already used up every bit of fuel that remained in the airline's storage tank. A huge gash on the underside of the tank had leaked the majority of it out into the frozen ground below the plane. He was pretty sure they were all going to die. Yet he did not want to give it up yet. Jack was out there, somewhere, searching for shelter, hunting for food. Miguel needed to hang on, or at least till his friend returned. But it was becoming more difficult not to let himself fall asleep into that endless, deep sleep. His thoughts began to wander, and soon he felt himself drifting off into another dream. He was young, on an evening stroll with Giselle, her hand in his. She was smiling at him, teasing him, and he turned to kiss her. But just as his lips met hers, the face was no longer that of his beloved Giselle, but the face of the Mavka. Miguel's heart skipped a beat and he woke with a start. A sudden thought came to his mind, an idea that made him sit up and shake his head to clear the fogginess that threatened to overtake him. The Mavka. Wasn't he tied to her in a way that was profound and otherworldly? Would she hear his call? He closed his eyes, and with all of the strength he could muster, he sent her a silent call. Miguel, are you okay? He could feel hands reaching out to him and shaking him, but they seemed so far away. Just let me sleep, he thought to himself, though his eyelids fluttered. As he began to enter a state of consciousness again, the pain in his chest took his very breath away. How it's better to sleep, he convinced himself, than face this excruciating pain. He felt the shaking again, and he heard a small voice calling out to him. Once again he tried to open his eyes, but it was like looking down through a dark, long tunnel. He thought he could hear a train coming, or was that the blood in his veins, sluggish and frozen, forcing its way through his arteries, trying to kickstart his heart. As his vision came into focus, he saw that it was the young girl leaning over him, the young girl he had first noticed when he stepped onto the plane. She had her water bottle held up to his mouth and was attempting to pour a little in. He blinked a few times and she smiled. I thought I lost you, she began to cry. Don't die, Miguel. Everyone else is dead except me and Jonas. The young man who had been seated a few rows up, one of the 6 passengers that had survived the crash and was now huddled by the last remnants of the fire, glanced up at the mention of his name. Miguel tried to sit up and winced painfully, grabbing at his side. The others? he managed to whisper through gasps of pain. The last time he had checked, the young girl had been huddled next to the boy she called Jonas, the one with the broken arm. And besides them, the middle-aged woman, the one who incessantly whispered prayers under her breath, sat with the other remaining woman, a blanket wrapped tightly around the both of them. "They're gone," the girl whispered. "It's just you and Jonas and I. Oh, and your friend Jack, who left hours ago. He hasn't come back, Miguel. I was scared we had lost you too," she cried softly, her tears freezing her eyelashes together. "I don't want to be the last one alive," she whispered. The wind cut like a blade through the desolate white expanse, howling through the skeletal trees that lined the frozen river. Jack moved through the snow, his wolf form a silent shadow in the endless cold. His breath came in short bursts, curling into the air like smoke. But it was the hunger that gnawed at him more than the cold. It felt like days since he'd eaten anything substantial, and even his heightened senses could do little against the deep ache of starvation creeping through his body. The wolves loped ahead of him, their powerful bodies built for this merciless land. They barely acknowledged his presence now, save for the occasional flick of an ear or sideways glance. He had proven himself by keeping pace and by reading their movements, by understanding the silent language of the wolf. He was an outsider, but not an enemy, and so they let him follow. The brittle ice beneath his paws cracked in places, the sound swallowed quickly by the wind. His instincts screamed for shelter, for warmth, but the urgency of his mission kept him moving forward. Back at the wreckage, the survivors were weakening by the hour. If he didn't find food or some sign of human habitation, anything to keep them alive, then they wouldn't last another night. The thought of it made his muscles burn with renewed determination. The lead wolf, a grizzled alpha with deep scars along his muzzle, suddenly stopped. His ears pricked forward. Jack halted as well, lowering his body instinctively. The others followed suit, crouching low in the snow, their eyes locked ahead. Jack sniffed the air. The wind carried the scent of blood. The wolves moved swiftly, weaving through the frost-bitten brush, and Jack followed. His own predatory instincts flared to life now that he was part of a pack. If the wolves had found a kill, there was a chance that he could take a portion. Just enough to bring back to the wreck site. The scent grew stronger, thick with the iron tang of death. And then he saw it. A caribou, or what was left of it, torn open, its ribs gleaming in the dim light. It hadn't been dead long, steam still curried from the exposed flesh. The wolves wasted no time ripping into the carcass, their hunger overriding any sense of order. Jack hung back for a moment, watching, waiting. Would they let him take a share? The alpha lifted his head, locking eyes with Jack. A tense moment passed between them, the wind howling around them like a living thing. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, the wolf stepped back, just a little bit, just enough. A silent offer. Jack didn't hesitate. He moved in, his fangs sinking into the warm flesh and the rich taste of blood and meat flooding his senses. It was primal. It was necessary. He tore away a portion, enough to carry back, then backed away as the others resumed their feast. The cold gnawed at his bones, but the raw meat in his jaws was a victory. He would bring it back to the survivors. They would last another day, maybe two, and then he would have to hunt again. But for now he turned back towards the wreckage, his paws pressing deep into the snow. The alpha male watched as Jack retreated, and in a low growl, barely more than a breath on the wind, he spoke in the language known only to the creatures of the wild. "Return to us. We will help you survive." The eternal winter night in Alaska turned the sky into a dismal, unchanging gray, robbing him of any sense of time. He didn't know how long he'd been away from the wreckage, or what he'd find when he returned. He could sense that Miguel was hurting worse than he let on. If he didn't find help soon, none of them would survive. As he neared the fallen aircraft, his fur bristled and the smell, unlike anything he'd ever smelled in his life, assaulted his nostrils. He stopped, sniffing the air. The stench was different from that of death, and besides, the dead were frozen in the snow. The bodies should not be decomposing at this temperature. So what was the smell that lingered around the plane? Cautiously, he stalked towards the wreckage. His senses were on alert. Someone or something had been there. Jack's paws pressed into the snow as he crept forward. Every muscle in his body tensed. The scent was heavy, cloying, smelling like something ancient and wild. It wasn't the scent of wolves or bears. Jack wondered if it was a hallucination, that while in a wolf form, maybe hallucinations were experienced as smells instead of visions. His ears flicked as the wind shifted, carrying the smell closer. Wrapping around him like an unseen force was a strange musky odor, thick and pungent, mixing with the lingering scent of the charred metal and the frozen blood. This was a predator's scent, no doubt about it, but unlike any he had ever encountered. He crouched low, scanning the wreckage ahead. The plane was as he left it, half buried in snow, the broken fuselage jutting out like the ribs of some massive, long-dead beast. But something had disturbed the area. Tracks, massive humanoid prints, pressed deep into the frozen earth, leading from the tree line toward the wreckage, circling it, then vanishing back into the darkened woods. Jack's hackles rose. He lowered his nose to one of the prints, inhaling deeply. The scent clung to the ice, unmistakable. Whatever had been here, it had simply circled the aircraft, then left. Was it just curious? A gust of wind howled through the broken trees, and for just a moment he thought he saw movement. A shadow shifting between the skeletal pines, something impossibly large. It was gone in an instant, vanishing into the darkness of the eternal Alaskan night. Jack's pulse pounded. He had heard the legends. Bigfoot, the old man of the mountain, the Yeti of the north, a beast that walked like a man but was no man at all. He had dismissed the stories as folklore, the ramblings of old hunters who had spent too many nights in the frozen wild. But now he wasn't so sure. Whatever it was, Jack decided it wasn't an immediate threat, at least not for right now. Right now, the more immediate concern was food and fire. Without those two things, there would be no survival. The change came slowly at first, then all at once. A violent, gut-wrenching shift that tore through Jack's body like fire and ice colliding. His muscles contorted, bones grinding against each other with an unnatural snap. He stifled a howl as his limbs twisted and reshaping, the fur retreating into his skin like water being sucked into the earth. His claws retracted, his snout shortened, and within moments, the beast was gone. And then the cold hit. A brutal, merciless force sinking into his newly exposed skin like the knives of pure ice. The fur that had shielded him was gone, leaving him bare and vulnerable to the Alaskan night. The wind howled around him, a hungry thing, lashing against his flesh. He staggered, gasping as the freezing air burned his lungs. His breath came in rapid clouds, his body trembling violently as he struggled to pull his clothes on with numb, shaking hands. His fingers barely worked, clumsy as he forced his arms through that stiff fabric of his coat. His jeans felt like ice against his legs. His boots were cold enough to send shooting pain up through his feet. His teeth clattered so hard that his jaw ached, but he forced himself to move, to press forward, to reach the wreckage before the cold had stolen what little strength he had left. The moment he stepped inside the plane, the stale heat of dying embers barely touched the icy grip wrapped around him. The smell of death was thick in the confined space. and it only took him a second to see why. Two bodies lay motionless near the back of the wreckage, wrapped in what little blankets they had, their faces pale and still. The two older women, gone. Jack closed his eyes for a brief moment, swallowing down the grim reality. There had been nothing he could do for them. His gaze snapped to the others. Miguel lay slumped against a broken seat cushion, his breathing shallow, skin waxen, his body curled towards the last fading embers of the fire. Rachel and Jonas huddled close to him, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. They looked up as Jack entered, hope flickering in their eyes for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "You found food?" Jonas asked. His voice was so hoarse. Jack nodded, setting the chunk of caribou meat down. "Yeah, we eat. Now." Rachel moved first, fumbling for the pocket knife she'd found in one of her backpacks, her fingers stiff with cold. Jack barely registered her actions. His attention was locked on Miguel. He crouched down, pressing a hand to his friend's forehead. Too cold, too weak. He was barely hanging on. Jack knew what had to be done. They needed more than food. They needed warmth. A real fire, a real shelter, and fast. Because if they didn't find a way to survive the night, Miguel would be the next body they'd have to bury beneath the snow. He knew where the trees were now, having mapped the terrain in his mind during his time in the wolf's body. The skeletal black trunk stood against the endless white, a distant promise of fire and survival. But the journey to the tree line was treacherous. Miles of deep snow, brutal winds, and a cold that could steal the life from his human body before he ever made it back. In his wolf form, he could reach the trees swiftly, cutting through the drifts with the ease of a creature born for this land. But a wolf couldn't carry firewood. His powerful jaws were made for tearing, not hauling frozen branches through the snow. The thought of returning empty-handed, of watching Miguel slip farther away, was unbearable. He had to find a solution. Fast. His breath came in quick, frosted bursts as he helped Rachel cook small pieces of the caribou over the fire's dying embers and feed them to Miguel. His gaze darted around the twisted remains of the plane. His mind was racing. The wreckage had given them some protection, but now it could serve a different purpose. The seats had metal frames, sturdy but light. The cargo netting in the back was torn, but it was still usable. An idea formed. Desperate, but possible. If he could fashion a crude sled, something that he could drag behind him when he returned to human form, he might be able to haul back enough wood in one trip to last them through the night. Now, it wasn't going to be easy. It would mean shifting between forms, pushing himself to the edge of his limits. But what choice did he have? Jack turned to Jonas and Rachel, his voice rough from the cold. "We're making a sled," he said. "Now." They didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. They just started moving, because they all knew that their survival would depend on it. Jack, he worked quickly, his hands stiff and uncooperative in the numbing cold. Jonas tore strips of fabric from the ruined seats, tying together what he could. Rachel found a length of half-buried cargo netting near the rear of the plane and helped Jack to secure it to the metal frame of two dislodged seat backs. It wasn't much, but it was something. Miguel stirred weakly, barely conscious. His breathing was shallow. His skin was pale beneath the layers of clothing and blankets. Jack knelt beside him, gripping his shoulder. "I'm getting wood," he said, his voice low but firm. "We're going to make it through this." Miguel's lips barely moved, but Jack saw the flicker of understanding in his fevered eyes. He squeezed the shoulder once, then stood, hauling the makeshift sled behind him. Stepping outside was like stepping into death itself. The wind howled, biting into his exposed skin, sinking deep into his bones. His human body was fragile out here, too slow, too weak. It wouldn't last long like this. He dragged the sled away from the wreckage. his boots crunching through the frozen crust of snow. He needed distance before shifting. If the others saw what he was about to do, there'd be questions. Questions that they just didn't have time for. When he was far enough away, he stopped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He shed his coat, then his gloves. The cold was unbearable, searing his skin like fire. He clenched his jaw and let the change take him. Bones cracked, muscles stretched and reformed. His vision sharpened as his body shifted, the pain swallowed by the rush of primal instinct. His fur thickened against the cold, his paws pressing firmly into the snow. He shook himself once, adjusting to the weight of his new form, then turned his gaze toward the tree line. Now he could run. Jack bolted forward, pulling the sled with his teeth, his powerful limbs carrying him swiftly across the frozen wasteland. The trees loomed closer, their dark forms reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. He slowed as he reached them, sniffing the air, scanning for anything that could be useful. Fallen limbs, thick and sturdy, enough to burn. Jack shifted back into himself again, the transformation leaving him breathless and shaking. The cold struck him like a hammer, but he ignored it, forcing his numb fingers to work. He gathered what he could, stacking the wood onto the sled, tying it down with the fabric strips. Every moment exposed was another chance for frostbite to creep in, for exhaustion to take hold. But he had what he needed. Now he could once again step back into the warmth of the fur, and not a moment too soon. Gripping the sled's crude handle with his teeth, he turned back towards the wreckage. The journey back would be slower, more grueling, but with each painful step he reminded himself of what was at stake. Miguel, Rachel, Jonas, they were waiting for him, and he would not let them die. It seemed to take forever, but finally Jack was within yards of the wreckage. He had to stop several times to readjust his grip on the sled, not being used to pulling the awkward contraption with his teeth, loaded down with wood. It was now dark, with barely enough light from the stars that had just begun appearing in the sky. Now that the storm had broken, and though he could see well in the dark, he had trouble locating the clothes that he had set aside. Feeling his way around the broken wings sticking up at an odd angle, he tripped over something lying in the snow. He recoiled, thinking at first that it was a body, one of the dead that they'd buried in the snow, perhaps dug up and drug over by one of the wolves or the other predators that had come snooping around that wreckage, drawn in by the scent of blood. Upon further inspection, he was surprised to find that it was not a body at all, but a stack of wood. Broken tree limbs, much larger than the smaller ones he had brought back with him in the sled. He knew, without a doubt, they were not there earlier. And laying on top of the pile, along with his clothes, were a couple of thick fur pelts. How strange, he thought, and quickly brought the pelts into the plane, covering Miguel and the two others. With the wood he had brought back in the sled, combined with a mysterious new pile of wood, he was certain that they would make it through another night. Off in the distance, the creature watched. It was taller than any man, broader than any bear, its fur thick and dark, matted with ice and age. His eyes were like molten amber burning through the veil of night. Scanning them, trying to understand this strange thing that had fallen from the sky and the two-leggeds that sheltered inside of it. He had watched that thing come from the sky, a great roaring beast of metal and fire, leaving a wound in the land as it tumbled from the heavens. The wind had screamed with its descent, and then the mountains had gone still, as if holding its breath. The creature had seen such things before, not often. He knew that the two-leggeds had traveled inside of him, and he had seen them occasionally, some lost, some searching, some never leaving the woods again. He had stood in the shadow of the trees, far below where that thing had fallen, and yet still close enough to watch. The thing had stopped moving, and now smoke curled from its broken frame. And the ones inside, he could sense them, weak, dying, their scent carried on the wind, mixing with the sharp tang of fire and blood. He had come close once before, just after it fell. He had circled from a distance, unseen and unheard, observing how the two-legged struggled, how they called to one another in their strange voices, how they stayed inside the wreckage as if it could still protect them. He had watched the one who was not like the others, the one who ran with the wolves. That one had left the wreck, shifting between the world of beast and man in a way that was unnatural, and yet the wolves had accepted him. This intrigued the creature. He had followed the wolfman's scent, trailed him through the frozen wasteland, curious. When he saw the two-legged come out of the wreckage, turn back into a wolf and pull that sled into the forest, he understood. And so he helped, bringing more of what was needed, wood and warmth. But now, as he stood at the edge of the tree line watching the wreckage, something else stirred in the air. Something far older than the two-leggeds in their fallen metal. He could feel a ripple in the stillness, a whisper that was not carried by the wind. The creature's muscles tensed, his heavy brow furrowing as he turned his great head towards the deeper woods. He knew this presence. He had felt it before, long ago, in the forgotten places of the earth where only the spirits tread. The Mavka. The forest sighed, the trees bending as if whispering secrets to one another. The air grew heavier, colder, despite the already bitter frost. And shadows moved where no light could have cast them, gliding across the snow without a sound. The creature did not retreat. He stood his ground. His massive hands were flexing, his breath slow and deep. The Mavka were not of flesh and bone like the two-leggeds, nor of earth and blood like himself. They were something else entirely, something that walked the line between the living and the dead. The creature did not fear them, but he did not trust them either. He took a step forward, the snow crunching beneath his weight. His amber eyes burned through the darkness, fixed on the shifting shapes that drew closer. Their movements fluid as mist, their presence sending a deep primal unease rippling through the land. The Mavka had come.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I hope you'll join us next week for another installment of the Wolfman Chronicles. And until then, have a great week, everyone.
Hey folks, Clay Steele here. You know, I spend a lot of time outdoors around this here campfire. If you're like me, you get downright annoyed by all those pesky mosquitoes buzzing around. They're just looking for a free meal. Nothing ruins a good night under the stars faster than slapping and scratching at bites. And that's why I keep the bee itch stop. I keep it handy. One swipe and that itch is gone. No more burning, no more scratching, just good old relief. Made right here in Nevada with all natural ingredients. It's safe for the whole family. So if you're tired of being a mosquito buffet, do yourself a favor and get you some bee itch stop today. And this is Clay Steele. Watch out for them bugs.